All right, folks. So, 1990s part two. So you'll notice this term narrowcasting keeps showing up, and um, what I'm doing is I'm focusing on how there was an explosion of genre in the 1990s, and that explosion of genre is the one thing that sort of carried the day across the digital divide of 2000 and the downturn of the sales of recorded music. On the other side of that, we have found the ability for everyone to sort of program their own personal playlists like a radio station would. And so we can all have our own, you know, radio station basically. And so instead of broadcasting, which is the old term of it, where radio stations had to try to suss out what a crowd of 500,000 people would prefer. Now we have narrowcasting, which is a much tighter selection of songs based on individual preference, and so the groups are getting the ability to narrowcast is to meet the preferences of very, very small groups down to an individual. And so when you see precedent to narrowcasting, I'm just showing how the 1990s, the success of the 1990s results in a proliferation of genre like we saw in the last one. So this is going to continue in that direction, and we'll look at world music, techno, and metal. And these, especially the world music, are some of my what I consider to be some of the greatest heritage of this particular time frame, the 1990s. So what you find on the world music stage is some Western players, English like Ry Cooder, or European like David Byrne from the Talking Heads, who's here. David Byrne, Ry Cooder, and Peter Gabriel, also an Englishman. All born around the middle of the 20th century. And so they are, in their 30s and 40s in the 1990s, and basically decide that they want to reach out across geographic borders and bring in a greater sensibility and awareness of popular music that is not so, English and American derivative, I guess you could say. And what they do and what they find is really incredible. Now, in terms of, roots music in the history, that's not as if they invented an awareness of roots music, nothing like that, but they are doing a lot to mainstream it in the 1990s. But you do have other examples of that are a little bit more or less isolated. Like, for example, the Wimba Away song we'll see in a little bit, which is made, Disneyfied by the Lion King movie. But it has a heritage that goes back to the 1930s as an African song by Solomon Linda and the Evening Birds, was then picked up in the 60s and then again in the 1990s. Ravi Shankar down here, personal friend of the Beatles. There's George Harrison, so he's helping him sort of learn the sitar as a mentor there. Paul Simon did 14 million in sales with his Graceland album, which was a West African collaboration. King Sunny Ade with Juju Music in the 1980s also. So this is little kind of examples of world music sensibility coming into center stage, if you will. So 1940, 1967, and then you see an uptick here with two in the 1980s. Now the Graceland album resulted then in an African tour, and so this is a short, a clip of one of the songs from that. But this is really fantastic music, and it has, I think, the best of popular music in its heart, in that it's bringing together people from vastly different cultural backgrounds, vastly different, who may not share even a common language, but then you have music there which is bridging those gaps, and it really is very powerful. And so kudos to Paul Simon on that. Some other success stories in the 1990s in terms of the world music stage. There is Ali Khan, who unfortunately passed in the 1990s at a young age, but he had a mystical singing tradition that was really interesting and used the harmonium. Peter Gabriel's Real World label signed him, and he was responsible for The Last Temptation of Christ. The musical score had a lot of Ali Khan's music. So that is worth note. And then Farka Touré is from Mali in West Africa, very close to Mississippi blues, which gives pause to wonder about the cultural heritage of the slaves that were transported to the United States in the 1700s. The fact of a resemblance to the blues that came out of Mississippi and then this popular music out of West Africa does give rise to the imagination in terms of common roots music. And so talking Timbuktu, so Ry Cooder collaborated with him in 1994, and that earned him a Grammy. So it's not just one or two artists here. We're starting to kind of see a trend. And here is an example of, there's the harmonium there. You can hear that on this video, but it's hand-operated reed instrument with a bellows, and so those guys are pulling the bellows by hand to create air pressure, and then playing a regular piano-style keyboard. Beautiful sounding instrument. Excuse me. All right, got a little excited there. Okay, the Wimba Away song, right? So in the 1960s, I promised you we would have some of British invasion era performers singing the Wimba Away song, and of course that is shortly, or 3 decades before the Lion King adopts it too. And so this is an example of what you could call Western assimilation, African music passing through these sort of multiple filters before it becomes, once you're Disney-fied, it's pretty for sure that you've been assimilated into the Western musical or Western cultural tradition, for sure. One of the greatest successes of the 1990s world music scene has to be the film Buena Vista Social Club, and it is a pre-2015. So it was illegal essentially for this to happen, but Ry Cooder accrued a $25,000 fine by as a guitar player, United States guitar player, going over there and reaching out to these Cuban musicians to expose their musical culture to the world. And so they are essentially our neighbors, but have been politically estranged, of course, after the Cold War. And it's interesting that as a culture, because of that, they're, a lot of the vehicles, as you can see, are 1950s vehicles. It's like kind of frozen in time, and so it's a fantastic kind of look into that culture. The film did $23 million, got an Academy Award, European Film Award, and led to a revival of Afro-Cuban and Latin music in its own right. So do make a note of that if you're interested in that. I do have one clip here from the film, and that's life in Cuba, and all of these old musicians coming together, and that's Ry Cooder up there. So fantastic. It's a clip from the film. You can check it out. Okay, changing gears a little bit. We can't forget that we are still, the popular music business is oftentimes not too far away from, um, other types of illicit and illegal activities. And so the all night dance parties that were oftentimes fueled by, MDMA slash ecstasy, this is a 20-year echo of the cocaine fueled disco parties of the 1970s. And so there are, once again, those kind of 2 decade echoes in time here that we're seeing. This, certainly differences to be recognized, but some parallels as well. It's not as if techno's trying to necessarily be disco, but it is. It does have that relationship between, I guess, amphetamine fueled, extra energy for dancing that oftentimes goes well beyond the limits of, you know, typical human capacity for, energy and stuff like that. Um, but in any case, the term techno is a pretty broad term in its own right. And so it refers to, US club music, European um, house dance music, and it has tons of subgenres underneath, trip hop, dark ambient, etc. And so what we find here is, drug fueled or not, you do have a proliferation of a wide set of kind of new subcultural identifications, categories, just as we noticed with, how punk was very powerful in that way. Another interesting, and so there is a documentary here, which is basically a news story from England about, from the 90s when nobody really knew what was going on except for the kids. And it's a news story about like the farmers are like, this is going on all night long and we don't know what these kids are up to. And so it's like a 8 or 9 minute piece. There's the constable, like the law, like anyway, it's funny to see from our point in time because it's no longer really a mystery, but for a long time it was a pretty underground movement, I guess you could say. Okay, so roots and long arc revivalism. So in the sort of rising tide floating all boats of the 1990s, roots music persisted from the it got deeper. The reaction against electronic music that we see in grunge music, you can, even though that is heavily amplified, it is very human in a way and sort of has a human dirtiness to it, that is organic in nature, but is also reflected in the name grunge music. Artists continued down that path to, and public taste did too, I guess is the more important part, but the revindication of, these sort of evergreen artists who had been overlooked and kind of past their prime, like Johnny Cash, with his American recordings. Very interesting collaboration there with Rick Rubin, who was really spreading his wings and demonstrating his versatility in multiple genres. Who's kind of the guy, the producer, whatever he touched turned to gold for a while there. Bob Dylan on the right, so there's Johnny Cash and Rick Rubin. Bob Dylan here with his Time Out of Mind album in the 1990s, very influential, very strong piece. And then you have, that in that same context of roots, American roots music, whether it's, traditional 60s singer-songwriter or 1960s and 70s, outlaw country player. You have kids coming up that were born maybe around late 70s, mid 70s, who were taking the revivalism to like past the first cycle of 20 years into like 40-year revivalism cycles, and so I call that long arc revivalism. And it's really interesting to listen to how well some of these artists, and this is, these long arc revivalists in, this particular instance, were hitting in the 1990s, but were incredibly astute students of 50s and 60s blues music, especially 50s, even 40s blues music. And so the Red Devils live at the King Palace is a really good example. Here's that record cover right here, 1992 release. Sean Costello, 1979. He passed in 2008. He has several albums, and I think we've got a selection here of one of them. So it's some good Chicago blues if you listen. To that. Now here is the Red Devil Band, with the Red Devils playing Overseas Blues Festival in 1993, a year after the King Palace CD, and you can see they're doing quite well for themselves. I don't know, this daytime slot might not be the best festival slot ever, but just take a look at this crowd here, and these guys are doing 1950s Chicago blues music, basically. So it's just amazing to see these cycles that are working their way. There's the picture of the crowd. At the same time, you've got artists that come together like the Traveling Wilburys. So Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne were able to persuade Bob Dylan and Beatle George Harrison, and there's Roy Orbison, to come together and form this supergroup. So you got Tom Petty, George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Jeff Lynne from Electric Light Orchestra, and Roy Orbison. And so here you have this sort of, once again, echo from, a lot of these guys were, Orbison's back in the 50s, these guys, 60s, 70s. So from a lot of different time periods, but playing a very rootsy sounding, it's kind of roots and pop together. I don't know if you're familiar with the Traveling Wilburys, but anyway, you can check that out. All right, so I'll wrap it up with a look at metal here. You get the 1990s. My dog's having a bad dream, so Louie, take it easy, pal. The kings of the genre in the 1990s were definitely Metallica. Their breakthrough album Master of Puppets 1986 made way for their self-titled Metallica 1991 release, which went 16 times platinum. They were part of the anti-Napster campaign. We'll see that when we get to the 2000s. Won 9 Grammys, and then they were usually held in contrast to Megadeth. The Peace Sells album, 1986, was their breakthrough. Rest in peace. They won 11 Grammys. So I've got a piece of theirs, Holy Wars, that you can check out. Other proponents from the 90s that were strong would include, Pantera and Slayer, started by James Hanneman, who passed in 2013, unfortunately. Produced by Rick Rubin once again, so he was doing Johnny Cash, he was doing hip hop, he was doing metal, and here's another example of I'm Broken Up. A couple metal tracks to share with you. So that's a look at the really prolific 1990s, everything that was going on, a little something for everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will be seeing you in the 2000s. Peace.